Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin McCabe with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, or CCUS initiative, an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. We have a particularly special event today as the webinar is brought to you in partnership with the Global CCS Institute, or GCCSI. Representatives from GCCSI and industry will be discussing environment, social, and government, or ESG, governance, or ESG assessments and CCUS. There's plenty to get to in this hour, so let's quickly review some housekeeping items before diving right into the presentations and discussions. If you can currently hear me, then you have already successfully connected to the audio for this event. However, and perhaps most importantly, if at any point you encounter technical difficulties with the webinar platform, you may contact the GoToWebinar's help desk at the number shown on the screen. That is 888-259-3826, and they should be able to provide most types of audio-video support. We encourage you all to submit questions at any point during the webinar. Just use the questions pane of the GoToWebinar platform, and the moderators will do their best to answer as many as possible at the end. Shortly following the conclusion of the event, the recording will be added to YouTube, and the presentation slides will be uploaded to the Clean Energy Solutions Center site, links for which can be found here. And before we move on to take a quick look at the agenda, a friendly reminder that the recordings from previous webinars held by the CCUS initiative are hosted in a dedicated YouTube playlist. The link on this slide will take you to the playlist, or perhaps easiest, you can simply search for Clean Energy Solutions Center on YouTube and click on the playlist tab. The SEM CCUS video playlist can be found there. We have a short presentation in store for us today, but before that, I'll provide a brief introduction of today's panelists. Then we'll wrap up with a Q&A and panel discussion session. We'll receive that brief welcoming statement from Juho Lipponen, coordinator of the SEM CCUS initiative, and that will provide us some context for today's webinar. And then, of course, following the presentation, we'll engage in the panel discussion and Q&A session. Our first panelist today is Ian Havercroft, Principal Consultant of Policy, Legal, and Regulatory within the Global CCS Institute. Ian is based in Melbourne, Australia, and leads the Institute's work program and consultancy activities across the policy, legal, and regulatory sectors. Also present today is Fiona Wild, Vice President, Sustainability and Climate Change with BHP and Deputy Chair of GCCSI. Fiona has over 20 years experience in multinational oil and gas and resource companies. Born in Liverpool, UK, she holds a degree and PhD in chemistry from the University of Edinburgh. We are also joined today by Mark Sisao de Silva, Managing Director of Energy with ING. Mark has worked at ING Bank for 20 years and is heading the energy technical team supporting ING's conventional and renewable energy financing globally. Finally, we will be joined by Eduardo Famini Silva, Director of Natural Resources and Energy with HSBC. Eduardo has over 15 years of experience in the energy sector across roles in strategy consulting, FP&A, and investment banking. And last but certainly not least, as I mentioned previously, our host and moderator for today's event is Juho Lipponen, coordinator of the SEM CCUS initiative. And with that, I'm happy to now turn things over to Juho for some brief opening remarks. Juho.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and hello, everyone. So my name is Juho Lipponen, coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative. So Kevin and your colleagues at NREL, thank you for hosting the webinar once again. And colleagues at the Global CCS Institute, thank you very much for co-organizing this event with us. The Clean Energy Ministerial is a global process that brings together 29 member countries from across the globe. This is really North and South, to collaborate on clean energy deployment. The SEM members make 90% of global clean energy investment, but are also responsible for 3/4 of global CO2 emissions. So this is a really very relevant global partnership process. Now, the SEM process has several work streams across all clean energy technologies, including also carbon capture. And the CCUS initiative brings together 12 of the SEM governments, and our common objective is to accelerate CCUS together. You see the member countries on the right-hand side of this slide. We work on strategy and policy level, and our work is government-led. However, it's not government only. So we're open to collaboration with industry and finance sector and key organizations with whom we can make advances in CCUS. I would also like to highlight that our initiative has an informal group for finance sector organizations, development banks, commercial banks, and others as a platform for knowledge sharing on CCUS. So if you are from a bank and if you're interested, please contact us at info@semccus.org and we can get you on our mailing list. So today's theme is environment, social and governance assessments and CCUS. This is an extremely relevant theme for clean energy and for energy transition, where we really need a step change in investment. We all know that despite advances, we're nowhere near being on track to deliver the Paris targets, for example. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to multiple $1 trillion worth of investment in this transition. But signs are positive. Just think about where we are now with the net zero discussion. It has come out of virtually nowhere to being very much the focus of current discussions. Now, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, is about 3 key factors that allow to measure the sustainability of an investment into a company or a business. And analyzing these criteria may help better determine the future financial performance of these companies. And we wanted to bring you a discussion on this theme in this webinar because it's time to start really looking at what impact ESG can have on carbon capture and vice versa. What might investment in CCUS do for ESG considerations in a company? So first we will hear a presentation and then we will be followed by a discussion in our expert panel who you will shortly meet. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Ian Havercroft from GCCSI for his welcome and then immediately the presentation. Ian, please.
Thank you very much, Juho. And on behalf of the Global CCS Institute, welcome to this evening's event. I'd like to thank the CEM for inviting us to participate. My presentation over the next 15 minutes, as it says on the slide, will look at the relationship between ESG assessments, carbon capture and storage. And I should start by highlighting the US DOE and in particular Mr. Jared Daniels, who supported the work and report upon which this presentation is based and was completed. This project was completed in October at the end of last year. Next slide, please. As I suggested, this was a piece of work that we completed on behalf of the US DOE and was aimed, as I highlighted in my first point, at looking at the significance and the extent of the influence of ESG assessments and ratings in supporting CCS project deployment. To this end, we considered 5 key questions, which I've highlighted in the slide there. Firstly, how a company's ESG rating impacts the company. How does a company's CO2 footprint or exposure impact its rating? How is CCS then considered when the ESG performance of a company with a significant CO2 footprint or exposure is rated? And whether the positive impacts of CCS, if at all, or if any, on a company's ESG rating support the business case for investment or financing CCS operations. And then finally, we considered somewhat of an outlier issue, but whether climate litigation and public policy impacts corporate risk and ESG ratings and how that's being approached. The study comprised a very detailed review of academic and industry literature and materials in the first instance. The second half of the study focused upon a series of targeted interviews and reviews with industry, particularly those industry interviewees with high CO2 footprints, investors and financiers worldwide, and also some ratings organizations. So firstly, let's consider briefly the report's findings in relation to each of the key questions. Next slide, please. So as I suggested, the first aspect of the report examined the impact of ESG ratings upon a company more broadly. And these 5 points really highlight the key conclusions from our research in this space. Firstly, reporting and scrutiny of ESG factors has really emerged as a very critical aspect of commercial behavior in recent years. ESG has really moved from a peripheral concern to a really central aspect of commercial activities. It's viewed not only as a requirement, but also as an opportunity by many organizations. And a number of the organizations, particularly the industry representatives that we spoke with, highlighted the fact that many of them have established discrete ESG practices or operations within their organization. This growing interest in ESG and the rise of ESG ratings has resulted in a significant rise in the number of ESG-related schemes. And as I've highlighted in the report, those include both voluntary and perhaps more proprietary schemes which have been developed by third-party ratings organizations. And many of you will be familiar with those organizations. They include organizations such as MSCI or Sustainalytics. The voluntary end of the spectrum, we have the quite well known, or very well known TCFD ratings, but also those provided by PRI and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB. Certainly, during our review, we realized that a very key factor in this uptake has been the definitive shift towards more mandatory forms of reporting. And as companies are moving towards greater levels of disclosure, this has largely been a result of transparency objectives which have been implemented in many instances by governments or market regulators, or indeed stock exchanges, who have introduced requirements in recent years. And only in the last week we've heard a major announcement in New Zealand with its amendments to the Financial Markets Act there, which will require greater climate-related financial disclosure once that bill passes. We've seen closer scrutiny of the links between ESG performance in relation to the allocation of capital, and indeed an organization's commercial performance. And there is a great deal of literature discussing this. Not only has this been of great interest to investors in the finance community, but also organizations themselves as they see significant opportunities in enhancing their ESG performance. Whilst many of these issues appear, the views around the significance of ESG appear to be crystallizing, the literature did also highlight the fact that there is a note of caution to be provided here as to how much certainty we can provide on some of these issues, particularly in relation to things like the link between ESG and organizational performance, for example. The final issue which I'd like to highlight here is the transition that we're perhaps seeing away from traditional shareholder primacy model. And there's been significant discussion in recent years as to how this is progressing. While many of us are familiar with increasing levels of shareholder pressure on organizations, it's interesting to note that many companies themselves are starting to consider this shift, and we've seen a number of instances where this has been raised publicly. One example would be the statement from the US Business Roundtable back in 2019. Klaus Schwab, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, made a very interesting statement at the start of 2020 where he said, the company not only serves all those stakeholders who are directly engaged, but also acts itself as a stakeholder of our global future. Statement like that, very much indicative of perhaps this shift away from the traditional shareholder primacy model. Interesting will also be, and something that I've highlighted in the report, is the impact of COVID upon investment strategies. And we've seen a number of announcements around how investors and indeed governments will approach future financing, particularly in post-COVID financing. There was a major announcement from Canada as to how the government will invest its post-COVID fund and what requirements it will place upon organizations in receipt of that funding. Next slide, please. So moving on from just the broad consideration of ESG itself, we then considered how CO2 or climate considerations are factored into ESG. And in particular, the significance of an organization's CO2 footprint and how that's addressed by ESG ratings. It's very clear that the E element, the environment within the ESG acronym, is a very important consideration and one that is being closely scrutinized by many. And certainly climate has become front and foremost within the consideration of the E ratings. And many have highlighted this is largely a result perhaps of the increased focus upon the climate as a result of the Paris Agreement, and indeed our subsequent commitments to net zero from many countries around the world. The materiality of an organization's greenhouse gas emissions are also increasingly under consideration. For those with substantial greenhouse gas emissions or a significant CO2 footprint, here we're seeing materiality becoming an incredibly significant consideration for them, where the focus shifts in particular to greater levels of disclosure or reporting as it may be required. In tandem, we're seeing rising expectations around the need for more detailed disclosure of climate-specific risks. And we've seen that particularly through the use of voluntary schemes such as the TCFD. And I should point out that this is not just a regulatory consideration. There's certainly been an expectation from investors and financiers, or indeed the wider public, for this greater level and more detailed disclosure of climate change risks within an organization. An important aspect of commercial assessments, however, an important aspect of commercial ratings assessment has been climate change considerations. However, I have noted here there has been significant caution expressed as to how climate change, for example, is considered within some of the more proprietary methodologies. And a number of those that we interviewed highlighted the fact that there was an absence of a standardized methodology in many instances, and that some of these rating schemes were perhaps a little opaque as to how they addressed this particular element. Next slide, please. The latter aspects of the study then considered the impact of CCS operations. And we started here with the hypothesis that in principle, CCS should perhaps positively contribute to the ESG performance of an organization with a significant CO2 footprint. In this instance, CCS for an organization of this nature would demonstrate an awareness of market and policy risks. There is clearly an opportunity here for the organization to directly reduce its emissions. And for many, it would also provide an opportunity as a low carbon investment for those supporting the technology and investing in the technology. However, very clear from both our assessment and our interviews is that the technology has received very little attention within the rating schemes, either the proprietary models or the voluntary schemes. In the appendix to the report that we've published, you'll see that only a small number of instances, in only a small number of instances, there is mention of carbon capture and storage, or where it could be potentially considered within reporting. However, it is very clear, and again, this was highlighted in our interviews, is that there is a significant potential for CCS to contribute to an organization's ratings, where it is reported as part of efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this was a view that was shared by some of the ratings agencies that we interviewed. Next slide, please. Finally, in relation to CCS, we then considered whether there was a business case for investing in CCS, where this could lead to ratings improvements. As I've suggested previously, the link between investment and ESG ratings is becoming clearer, and there is considerable potential offered by CCS to address the critical climate element of many ratings assessments. However, what we have observed is that CCS remains somewhat of an outlier, and this is a view being expressed by investors in particular, and indeed the ratings agency. Many were familiar with the early successes in promoting the technology a number of years ago, but were subsequently unaware of the developments that have taken place in recent years, and including the more significant development that we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years. One statement that was made, however, was even where we did include CCS and it did provide a demonstrable benefit, an improvement in ratings performance alone was unlikely to drive investment singularly. Ultimately, it is just ratings performance was just one aspect of the organization's wider strategy. Next slide, please. The final issue, as I mentioned, we considered was somewhat of an outlier, but has emerged as a very significant consideration for industry and investors, and that is the issue of climate litigation. And here I focused upon two particular areas, and that's litigation where it's focused upon, for example, directors' perceived failures to consider or address climate change in their investment strategies, but also some of the examples of strategic litigation that's been aimed at effectively shaping policy approaches and investment decisions. And we've seen a number of examples of this globally. Clear again is that this factor is largely unaddressed by rating schemes, but both industry and the ratings agencies highlighted the fact that this was likely to be included within controversy factors. And I've highlighted in my final slide just some of the feedback that we received in relation to this issue, which really does demonstrate that this is an issue that is of great significance and likely to be of increasing significance going forward. And again, something that many organizations are starting to pay much closer attention to. Next slide, please. And I'll finish here with 4 perhaps very simplistic conclusions for what is a very detailed report. And it's clear from my assessment that ESG ratings are now playing, as I said, a very significant role with a range of different parties, and including the broader public. Within this, climate change really is a very critical consideration, and one which is of increasing significance. There is certainly a growing expectation for companies to disclose their performance and in a manner that is readily accessible. And this is being driven not only by new and emerging regulatory requirements, but also broader and a much wider group of stakeholders, including the general public. While to date we've seen CCS largely unaddressed within many of the rating schemes and assessment frameworks, reporting models, it is likely, and this was the view of many of those that we've interviewed, that more widespread scrutiny of emissions reductions, particularly in the context of our broader commitments to net zero and in post-Paris, we are likely to see wider deployment of the technology and financial commitments to the technology, and this may in fact drive greater uptake or review and scrutiny of CCS within these ratings methodologies. My final slide, please. I just link here to a picture of the report's cover, which is now available in the publications section of the Institute's website, and I would be very grateful for any comments or feedback that you may have. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Bert.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that great introduction and overview of your report, which indeed is available for download on the Institute website. If I could ask all the other panelists also to switch their cameras on, and we will start the panel discussion section of today's meeting. Fiona and Mark there. It seems that Eduardo may have dropped. He will come back on in any moment now. But let us begin. So, Ian, thank you for the talk, and Fiona and Mark, many thanks for joining the panel today. Great to have you with us. And audience, please, you can send your questions to the questions panel, and we will make time to answer questions during this session. So feel free to send them through. But to kind of gently break us into the discussion, I was going to ask Fiona and Mark for your first general impressions about what Ian just presented. General remarks, thoughts, does this resonate with you, and so forth. So Fiona, maybe you first.
Sure, thanks very much, Juho, and thanks, Ian, for the fantastic presentation. It absolutely resonates for me. So as Juho and Kevin mentioned in the introduction, I work for BHP, which is a very large multi-commodity producer. We produce iron ore, metallurgical coal, oil and gas, copper, nickel, and potentially potash. And we have a lot of commodities in our portfolio that investors are very interested in. We also have a very high CO2 footprint in terms of particularly our scope 3 emissions in our value chain. So there's an awful lot of interest in the way that we produce the commodities that we sell, and also what those commodities are used for and their role in a low carbon transition. So for us, there has been an increasing level of interest around ESG. So I absolutely echo the comments that Ian has made about this increasing interest from investors in ESG issues, and effectively climate becoming a sort of major proxy for ESG issues more broadly. I also thought it was really interesting what Ian said about the proliferation of standards, and that obviously highlights the level of interest, but it also can make it very difficult from a company perspective in knowing what information to disclose and where. And certainly the time frame between expectations being mooted and then translating into benchmarks and expectations is extremely short now. I remember just before Christmas, I was talking to an investor who had a particular idea about a particular type of metric they might be keen to see, and by February that appeared in a standard that was released. So the activation energy, if you like, for these sorts of things can now be somewhere between sort of 6 to 8 weeks. So the rate of expectation is really, really fast in a way I haven't seen before. One thing I highlight around CCS in particular, I think there's extremely limited awareness around the role that CCS can play, and increasingly limited recognition of its absolute criticality, particularly if you're looking at a 1.5 degree scenario. I've had investors say to me that 1.5 scenarios, for example, that include CCS are wrong because CCS can't be part of the solution. So I think CCS really doesn't have yet the recognition that it deserves when we're thinking about green investments, green capex, and green revenue. So from my perspective, I think it's really important that we take opportunities to enhance the understanding of the role of CCS, particularly as you've mentioned, Juho, as we think about the role of net zero targets, because CCS will have an increasingly important role to play as we head towards net zero.
Thank you, Fiona. I think we'll come back to this final point of yours during the discussion, definitely. Eduardo, great that you were able to join us back.
Yeah. Hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you, and we started the first round, which was basically general comments on Ian's presentation. And Mark, if we go to you next, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I recognize a lot what Fiona says as well. Things go very fast and quick, and I find it an impressive presentation, Ian, and yeah, I think interesting that you indicate as well that improvement in rating performance alone is unlikely to drive investments, because obviously the companies that are making these investments are really also motivated not only by the ESG ratings, but they look at carbon tax, they look at subsidy schemes, potential climate litigation, as you mentioned, of course, is very important in their ways. And we see that a lot with clients at the moment. You also indicated that carbon capture is still a bit of an outlier technology in ESG, right. But there's also a trend recently that we see in the oil and gas industry, and that I'm only talking about sort of the last 9 months, that they are increasingly picking this up. And it seems that in the current hubs, like the North Sea, for example, companies they have the capabilities, the infrastructure, sometimes the balance sheets as well, and they see more and more interest in CCS. So I see a lot of positive movements there, but ESG is very important to make this and to monitor it and to report it, of course. So yeah, very interesting presentation.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, Eduardo, general comments.
Yeah, Ian, I found the report very interesting. I think in the first hand, it's a bit corroborates what's the general feeling we have, that ESG is getting a lot of traction, and that's actually ESG ratings are pretty critical these days. And talking from the perspective of a capital provider, the logic and way that this capital that's available today for sustainable investment will be allocated is based on ESG rating. So the importance of the ESG rating is really high. And in the context of CCUS in particular, I'm a believer that ESG ratings can indeed make the difference to have more of this capital that's already available, but being moved a higher share of this capital into CCUS, which, as Fiona said, and I totally agree, is an absolutely critical technology for us to get to a world of net zero.
Thank you, Eduardo. Look, Ian and I are co-hosting this panel, even though Ian gave the talk, in an interesting position to maybe say something as from an expert perspective, but also to quiz the others. So, Ian, I leave the question to your capable hands.
Thank you, Hugo. I have a question, Fiona, and it perhaps builds upon one of the statements that Mark picked up on, which was there's a broad range of factors considered by investors in particular, but from a industry perspective, within BHP, obviously, does ESG really present a real opportunity, or is it in fact a smaller consideration within your broader reporting requirements, for example, or your strategic approach?
It's absolutely, it's a core component of what we report, and it does present a real opportunity for us. So an example might be 5 years ago, so I've worked on climate change at BHP for about 10 years now, and 5 years ago I started to make some annual trips to talk to our investors in the UK, Europe, and in the US. And I would normally be able to fill up a diary with a week's worth of meetings in UK and Europe, but it's quite difficult over in the States to sort of, get a good series of meetings organized when the focus was around climate change in particular. Now it's a completely different, you don't even need to organize ESG related investor engagements anymore, because every single investor that you have will talk about ESG related issues with you. So it's not even about going to find those particular proxy advisors or ESG advisors anymore. Every single mainstream investor wants to talk to you about ESG related issues. So it's become completely mainstream and much more hardwired into the overall assessment of the company, which from my perspective is really good, because these issues are critical to a company's performance and need to be hardwired into the way that we design our strategy and we make our capital allocations and investment decisions. So it's a really good outcome, but it has become completely core to the conversations that we have with investors in BHP. I mentioned, I think that within ESG, we obviously have environment, social, and governance related issues. I think governance related issues have been, high on the agenda for the last sort of 15, 20 years, but climate has certainly kind of ramped up and is now one of the first topics that we will talk about with our investors. And I find the engagements on ESG really valuable. So I think there's perhaps sometimes an expectation that it's quite a difficult place for industry to go to talk about some of these risks that we may be exposed to, and opportunities, of course. But I think what I found is there's a lot of learning going on in this area at the moment. So nobody has all of the answers. we're all exposed to risks, and the nature of those risks change by jurisdiction, they change by commodity in our case, they change over time. And by having active engagement with investors on these topics, we can share what we know, we can share what we don't know, we can learn, we can identify what's useful, what's not useful. And so I find that the engagement that we have with our investors around ESG not only helps educate investors, obviously, as you would hope, around the challenges and the actions that we're taking to address those, but also helps us learn what's important and what's not in terms of the investment decisions that those investors are making. So it's I think it's quite a collaborative process that we're in at the moment as we learn what matters, what perhaps doesn't matter, what may need to be prioritized, for example, CCUS, and what may not be the sort of silver bullet that people hope. So I think it's very much a learning process, and the momentum is really building, but also the kind of practical application of some of this capital allocation. So I think there's a lot of positivity and momentum in the system at the moment.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Fiona, for that. Moving to you, Mark, then. ING, a major finance house. What is ESG for you in your daily work? How does it impact the company, but your wider investment portfolio? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. ING as a commercial bank, it was always important for them environmental and social responsibility. So we, let's say already more than 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we started with equator principles, for example. These are basically environmental and social guidelines for project finance. But much later on, we took the lead in what we call the Terra approach. It's basically bringing our lending portfolio in line with the 2-degree global warming path or the targets of the Paris Agreement. And what you at the moment see is that ESG for our, let's say, energy clients is becoming indeed much more important, like basically Ian and Fiona also indicated. And that is a recent trend that we see specifically for oil and gas companies, for example. There's a lot of our clients that have sort of well-developed ESG policies now, and they are based on their footprints, their CO2 footprint. They're going to measure that, and they are trying to give targets like KPIs, key performance indicators, to reduce their footprint with, let's say, 20 to 30% over a period of our loan, let's say 5 years, and with a target to be CO2 neutral within a certain period of time. And as a bank, we are, for example, providing an incentive scheme to that. So if they make the goals, we give them a little bit less of a margin that they have to pay on our loan. And if they are not making their goals, they pay a little penalty. So it's like an incentive scheme on their margins. And that is some trend that we see now, let's say for the last half year. It's coming up, and most of the upstream clients are very interested to do that. And it's not only the CO2 footprint, but for example, also if they do projects like electricity, offshore electricity, getting it from from shore, and that's with green project like the hydropower in Norway, for example, or CCS projects that they do, or even carbon credits that they plant trees. That's also one of the schemes we have recently seen. And so the whole package together is becoming very important. So I think it's like Fiona says, it's come up soon, and it is a very positive development, I think.
Thank you very much, Mark. I had a question for Eduardo. Again, from a financier's perspective, how do you perceive ESG as enabling future investment in CCUS specifically? And vice versa, how can CCUS help an investor to potentially achieve some of its ESG goals?
Well, Ian, I think the ESG thematic is really a necessary prerequisite for CCUS investment. I mean, the rationale is very simple. As of today, CCUS isn't a technology that is profit-making, And this is because you cannot market the carbon dioxide you produce. There is no demand for that, right? So you have all the economics of projects that are very expensive and you cannot recoup the value of that investment. So were it not for ESG, there would be not CCUS. I think that's quite clear to me. And within the scope of the ESG thematics, the ESG ratings, as I said earlier, pretty critical guide to investors. There is an immense amount of capital, tens of trillions of dollars. And I'll speak for HSBC. We have pledged up to $1 trillion in the next 10 years on climate solutions, really large quantums. And how would this capital be allocated? People will be referring to these ESG ratings, right? And the logic will be, how does universe of investable projects rank within these ESG ratings? And I think now back to CCS in particular, I think the bad news is, unfortunately, the ESG ratings as they are constructed today, they tend to indirectly favor some more established and cost-efficient technologies, which for me is a problem. And also, no doubt, we require that additional activation policies are implemented on top of the ESG ratings for us to see a large-scale deployment of CCUS. So I think the ESG thematic is critical, the rates are critical, but possibly just not sufficient. Now, to the second part of your question, I think, yes, CCUS clearly can play a critical role in companies achieve their ESG goals. And I'll bring just two examples. One, regulatory compliance. As regulations get more and more stringent, actually CCUS may be, especially for some industries such as steel, the difference between surviving or going out of business. That is in some years down the line. And another thing that I really believe in is that more and more consumers will start to more and more differentiate products that are low in carbon, and that will result in a premium. Therefore, having CCUS may also be a way for the best companies in a sustainability standpoint to differentiate in the marketplace and be the best in class.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eduardo. Thank you also for bringing a quantitative element to the discussion. There was already an audience question about what might clean investment mean in practice in dollar terms for you. So thanks for that, and others may comment on that also during the discussion. Fiona, I wanted to come back to you. You are a member of the TCFD, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. For the audience, for those who may not know what it is really, they may have heard the acronym. Can you say a few words on its role, on where it is and what it is doing?
Yeah, sure. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, as it's more commonly known, was established back in 2015, just after or just around the time of the COP in Paris. And it was really designed to help companies understand and be able to disclose the financial impacts of climate change. And it's based on the concept that if information is known and can be disclosed, then the market can begin to price risk. So effectively avoid a global financial crisis triggered by climate risk. So it was chaired originally by Mark Carney, the then Governor of the Bank of England, and also Michael Bloomberg. And we were given a task to go away in about a year or so to determine what information non-financial and financial companies should disclose to the market to be able to enable it to make more informed decisions around climate impacts. And it took us all of that time to get to the point, and what we ended up coming out with was some recommendations in 2017 that focused on the key areas of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And rather than talking about this is the information, or these are the metrics that you need to use, or these are the numbers that you need to provide, effectively what the TCFD does, or the recommendations do, is they ask a number of questions of a company. So they ask a company about how do you identify climate risks? How do you consider climate-related risks in your strategy and decision-making? How is your board involved in those sorts of discussions? So it's really about asking questions, and eliciting a response. So it's trying to encourage companies to think through the potential impacts of climate change, the financial impacts of climate change, and disclose that information to the market. It's not standardizing disclosure in a sense, but it's standardizing the questions that companies should ask themselves in order to be able to make more informed disclosures to the market. I don't think any of us on the TCFD had any idea just quite how successful the work was going to be. So I think the TCFD has become a kind of mainstay of climate-related disclosure, which is great. We're really pleased with the success that it's had. I've got some recent numbers from the TCFD Secretariat, and we have supported 2,000 companies with a market cap of $20 trillion US, and financial institutions responsible for assets of over $175 trillion US across 78 countries. So as my children would say, this has really gone viral. It is really a mainstream approach now to disclosure, and it's also becoming mandatory in some jurisdictions. So it is a voluntary process at the moment for disclosure, but we are seeing it being picked up by some jurisdictions as a mandatory framework for disclosure. And the real, I guess what we're really aiming for is for all companies to start thinking through what climate means for them from a financial perspective and encouraging them to disclose that potential impact in their financial accounts.
Thanks, Fiona. That's really interesting. A quick follow-up. In the meetings of TCFD, when you were working on these principles, did technologies come up? Was carbon capture ever mentioned? Out of curiosity, did it come up at all in those?
I mentioned it a lot. Sometimes people rolled their eyes at me. So I think that the conversations we've heard up to this point about perhaps a lack of recognition of the role that CCS can play, that was very palpable in the TCFD discussions. I think sometimes there is a view that the climate challenge is a power challenge, and therefore it can be fixed by renewables. And that if we just deploy renewables as much as we possibly can, we'll get there. And that obviously doesn't acknowledge the fact that emissions come from lots of different sectors, and some of them are extremely hard to decarbonize, and renewables won't actually be able to do all of that work. And so I think as we see particularly the industrial sector coming more to the fore, and this understanding about the hard to abate nature of those emissions, CCS becomes a much more obvious solution. But no, it was actually, it's very hard, I think, to put CCS on the menu of climate mitigation tools. Often people don't want to put it there. And I think that's because sometimes people see it as a fig leaf for the fossil fuel industry, whereas when I look at it, I see it as a tool that is absolutely critical if we're going to reduce emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, particularly if we're 1.5.
Thank you, Fiona. Thanks.
Thanks. And sorry, you opened me to cut you off there. I was proposing we go on to looking at the time. I had a question perhaps for all of the panelists, and is essentially at the heart of where we go next from the work that I did, really, and some of the conversations we've been having. We're all agreed, as we've just had as we've just said over the last 5-10 minutes, that there is clearly a significant role for CCS going forward. And we've also agreed that there is a significant role for industry investors in utilizing ESG. How do we marry the two going forward, where we recognize that there is clear utility in ESG assessments for all three sectors? How do we leverage that utility in supporting CCUS? Is there a specific approach that could be adopted? Are there specific issues that need to be addressed? If I come to each of you individually, I'll start with Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question, and I think yes, we see the importance, like Fiona said, it is extremely important to have CCS there. I think also we see that ESG needs to be measured, so an independent advisory, like you already mentioned, MSIC, and also Sustainalytics, and there are a couple of other independent advisory firms, of course. I think maybe there's a key there that they make sure that they include any type of CCS projects within a good measurement system, such that the investors that are doing these projects are getting the credit for that. I think that is an important element that I can see, because I know from our clients that sometimes it is a bit uncertain what sort of credits they get for the measures they take. And so there's a bit of uncertainty there. So more clarity and transparency there in the advisory side will be good, I think. And also what I discussed a bit with Juho before is the EU taxonomy. I think it's a very important signal that EU taxonomy, but that's only for Europe then, but still, if they provide very clear guidance that CCS is part of the sustainable projects, and then also financial institutions can easily finance that by green finance even. And green finance is something that opens a wider investment base than only commercial banks, for example. So I think that is an important element as well to make this flying a bit. Yeah, that's the thing that came up with me.
Great, thanks so much. Eduardo, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, firstly, I totally agree with Mark, but I'd like to bring two additional points. I think one, the financial community is very used to the rating systems, but I think in the case of CCUS, I think we need kind of a different element, a different spice. We need the ESG rates not only to deliver to the finance community, but also to policymakers. Because I think we all agree that we do need government intervention and action to enable large-scale CCUS. And the ESG ratings could be a tool to help governments also to decide which project to back. Right? And the second element, I think it would be quite important in the ESG ratings to then enable real action is, I think there is an element of collaboration that could be built into the ESG ratings. If you think through the bulk of the existing projects and those with highest chance of success, these are cluster projects, which encompass a number of companies from carbon capture, actually from carbon emitters, and then carbon capture technology, infrastructure to transport the carbon, expertise to sequestrate. There is typically projects involve a multitude of companies. So if the ESG ratings and then as a result policy action could then incentivize more collaboration, so we have more of this cluster type of projects, then you can have a circle that's virtuous. You have like the technology being kicked off, then these clusters would reduce the average costs of carbon capture and storage, and then that could bring other players to tie into that infrastructure that's already in place, and then you create a whole industry from that. So I will add these two elements, the support to government policy and support to collaboration is quite key.
Great, thank you. Fiona.
I guess echoing what my colleagues have said, I think from an investment perspective, it starts with the recognition of the importance of CCS. I think we don't have time to pick and choose the technologies that we like anymore, nor do we have time to pick the sectors that we prefer to focus on anymore. So I think, if you go to the 1.5 report that the IPCC put out back in November 2018, it's really clear in 3 of those 4 scenarios, CCS plays an absolutely fundamental role to get to 1.5. So we don't have the luxury of being able to say, I would like to reduce emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, but I choose not to use CCS at all. I just don't think we have the luxury of doing that. So there needs to be a recognition that CCUS is a technology which can be deployed and should be deployed if we're serious about getting to those outcomes. With that recognition, then it needs to translate into measures. So as others have mentioned, I think it's really important that when we put nomenclature in place, taxonomies in place, that the role that CCUS can play in carbon storage more broadly is identified. So if we're talking about investments in green activities, green investment, green revenue, green capex, it needs to include CCUS, because at the moment it's completely absent from the debate. And there is often a sort of disconnect between what people sort of want to call green and what actually might be delivering or enabling decarbonisation in various sectors. So there's that recognition, and then there's translating that into the nomenclature that we can then use to identify capital flows. And then, as others have mentioned, I think policy support is the other area, whether that's in terms of national policy setting around things like carbon pricing or investment incentives or long-term storage regulations, or whether we're looking at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and how that can really galvanize an international response. But I think all of those things around the recognition, translating that into these standards and taxonomies that are being established with that policy support, then we have an opportunity to really get CCS moving at the scale we need to if we are going to address or achieve those goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thank you.
Great. We have a couple of minutes left before we have to wrap up. And looking at the audience questions, by the way, thanks everybody for sending in these. There's been a lot of interesting questions, and we've treated a few of them through the previous discussion already. One thing that is in a few of these questions is BECCS or negative emissions and CO2 utilization, as opposed to if you like plain vanilla carbon capture and storage. Is there a difference here as regards ESG? Should there be? Do you see anyone want to comment on those two points?
I'll have a quick go. I don't think there's a great difference in people's minds, to be honest. I think possibly there might be slightly more interest in negative emissions technologies than you kind of vanilla CCS, because there's a sort of, it's got a little bit of that new technology sort of exciting feel to it, possibly. But I think when you sort of scratch beneath the surface and remind people that it's actually, you need CCS to make it work, sometimes people can kind of back away. So I don't think there's a significant premium in terms of recognition for BECCS or for other technology. I think that they often suffer from the same issue, which is they're sometimes seen as a sort of fig leaf for ongoing use of fossil fuels, when actually they are fundamental tools to remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah, I agree with Fiona. I think there is a bit more positive recognition perhaps for the utilization part, because it immediately changes the CO2 in something useful. Sometimes even in fuels, but the problematic part that I see, because we have reviewed a lot of new technologies in the utilization side, and that it is all at a very early stage. It does not really bring big numbers. You know, you will not get the same numbers as CCS. You need CCS basically. That's what Fiona says. It's 10% of the solution, and utilization will come, and I personally think it will come in 10 to 20, 30 years, and then maybe you can even use the CO2 that you now store to do something useful with it. So that's always possible, but I don't think it is something that makes a difference now. Still too expensive in many occasions as well.
Yeah, I totally concur. I think the issue is time and cost. I see in 2050, for us to achieve a world of 1.5, DAC and BECCS being part of the answer. But as of today, they're just too costly. So I think they are part of the same framework. But if you manage to focus actually on the mainstream CCS, I think that naturally enable anyways in 10, 15, 20 years, more development of BECCS and DAC, etc., when costs go down.
Wonderful. I believe we're going to have to draw this to a close. So Fiona, Eduardo, Mark, many thanks for your expert views. Ian, thanks for the presentation and for being a wonderful co-host. And everybody, wherever you are, at whatever time you're following this, thank you very much for joining us. Today we've had folks from very early morning and up until very late evening live here, and in the audience, everything in between. So thank you very, very much. And we'll end here, and we'll give the floor to Kevin to wrap up the event. Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks Juho, and thanks again to all our panelists for that great Q&A discussion session. there were a number of questions we might not have had a chance to get to during that session. We'll try our best to connect with those attendees offline after the webinar. So just to quickly wrap up, if you would like to learn more about the SEM CCUS initiative, please reach out via the channels provided here on this slide. And to stay up to date on news and developments within this initiative, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. A number of these links are a little bit lengthy, so most can be found just from a simple Google search of Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative. So one final time, I'd like to extend a thank you to our panelists and especially to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We appreciate your time and please enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you back at future events. Thank you, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.